Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you along to today's webinar. We've got a brilliant crowd on today. We've got lots of people from representing different industries, different geographies. So thank you all for joining us, and welcome. I'm joined today by two of my esteemed colleagues, as ever. I have with me today Dr. Eloise Crush, who heads up our insights team and has done her PhD in psychological resilience and the protective factors around psychological well-being. And I'm also joined by Dr. Brian Marion, who is a health psychologist, a medic, and the other co-founder of the Positive Group. Good afternoon, both of you.
Hi there.
Hi.
So today we are taking on the subject of measurement around psychological health. And in particular, we're going to look at how do you measure what matters, and what are the pitfalls and the opportunities for taking a proactive approach to psychological health in the workplace. But just before we get on to the workplace, I'd love to just get your thoughts on the current context. We've been in lockdown now for, well, on and off for a year. We had the anniversary, I think, yesterday. Throughout that period, mental health and psychological health has been in the conscious awareness of everyone. I mean, the amount of research that's been released, the amount of news and press around it has been huge, and most of that has been quite negative press, and that data is showing quite a devastating impact around general psychological health, but also for certain groups, particularly younger people, obviously frontline workers, minorities. So I suppose what I'd just like to do first of all is to probably hit you with a very difficult question, and I'll start with you, Brian. But just what's your take on where we are at the moment, and what the future holds in terms of psychological health?
Well, I think you're right. I think this is very topical, the impact of the pandemic on people's psychological well-being. And there's really robust data now showing that pre-COVID, the prevalence of psychological problems in the working population was about 1 in 6, so 15% of us would fulfill the criteria for a common psychological problem at any one time. That figure has gone up to 1 in 3, both from our own Office for National Statistics, UCL, in America, the Census Bureau, and the Kaiser Family Foundation. So there's robust data showing there's a big uptick in the prevalence of psychological problems. But I'd also suggest that is totally normal. Whenever there's a natural disaster, or even a man-made disaster, such as wars or financial crises, people respond by feeling stressed and anxious because it impacts on their lives. And this pandemic has tentacles into all sorts of aspects of our lives. And there was a blog recently saying, we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. Some of us are in super yachts, some of us are in a small dinghy, and some of us don't even have a boat. So I think there's differential susceptibility, because we all vary in our susceptibility to things, but also there's differential circumstances. And I think we need to recognize that. But human beings have an amazing capacity to recover from adversity. And I think we need to bear that in mind. And I would just preface this by saying that there's a sort of psychological continuum where we're flourishing or languishing and become distressed. Now, I think that's normal. I think the real danger is getting stuck. And one of the sad things about getting stressed or distressed or depressed is it's very sticky. And what we should be looking at is, what are the risk factors for getting stuck? And what are the protective factors that can help people regain their equilibrium and recover their well-being more quickly? But I think what we're seeing is a very natural response to a pretty major disaster that's impacted the globe.
Absolutely. And I think we talked about this in the last webinar. The focus of the press is often that of a negative one. We've seen some articles over the last few months about the coping, the levels of resilience. So I think a lot of this is the reporting of this is actually, what we're actually focusing on is plays a big part in that. Elle, just from your perspective, you've been looking at data across the workplace, working with clients around this. What are we seeing in terms of the workplace and professionals?
Yeah, so I think you need to be really focused on which group you're looking at. So if you're interested in psych health of the general population, obviously a lot of the media is kind of focused on those bigger picture stats. But I think what's really interesting about the workplace and professionals is they're probably slightly lower risk than the general population. And this relates to the fact that things like poverty and unemployment are in fact risk factors for psychological health. So in fact, employment itself should be fairly protective. But I think in terms of just some numbers around the psych health of professionals, we're seeing the most common problem being reported is anxiety. So that's feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge. We're seeing, and then people related to that can feel quite overwhelmed. And we're seeing that affecting about 1 in 3. So people reporting that on most days or every day. And then the next most common is sort of low moods, so people feeling more depressed, little interest or pleasure in doing things. So you see that affecting about 1 in 4. And linked to both of those, you see about 1 in 3, 1 in 4 is really struggling to stay focused and feeling quite distracted. And that taps into sort of worry and anxiety too. I think on the flip side of that, and a bit like Brian was mentioning around resilience, I think we look at psychological health, but we look at resilience and coping measures. So if people are reporting lower mood, especially during a pandemic, or feeling anxious, but they're also feeling they're able to cope and feeling quite resilient, you're perhaps less concerned about that group than the group that are perhaps feeling really overwhelmed, can't cope, and actually are going to struggle to sort of return to a better equilibrium. So when we look at that data, so you take it all into account, you're looking at about, I'd say, just over half of the sort of professionals that we've seen within firms we work with are doing pretty well. So they're reporting pretty good psychological health and reporting quite high levels of coping and resilience. And we see about 1 in 4 in that group that I mentioned who are referring to, who are feeling maybe less able to cope and also reporting psychological health problems. So hopefully that sort of frames the crisis, the discussion.
Indeed, it does. Thank you both for that. I'd love to get on to the workplace, and we'll touch on some of that, some of those factors in a second. Just before we do, I just wanted to share with our audience that we've launched the Positive Leaders Program, or what we call the first open Positive Leaders Program. So this is where individuals from any sector, any walk of life can join our programs. We've got one starting in the spring. We're about to release some dates in the summer and the autumn as well. So if anyone is interested in learning about the psychological skills that we teach across our program, learn from our psychological team, people like Brian and Elle, then do drop us a line. I think we're going to put a link in the chat shortly, so anyone who's interested in that can get in touch. So just coming back to the workplace, let's just start, Brian, by looking at why measurement is so important, and why is it relevant to effectively effectively supporting proactive psychological health.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a sort of concept around this is, you don't know what you don't know. And when you start to measure things, you can start to identify what the problem is. And that data, that information can be really powerful. So I think when you start to measure things, it starts to actually give you some idea of what matters. And I think in psychological health, this is really, really powerful. And I think it's Peter Drucker's line that says, what gets measured gets managed. And if you don't measure things, then you don't know what the problem is. And I mean, in physical health, we've seen this for years, whether that's cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugars. We know they matter, but we didn't used to measure them. Now we can measure them and we can intervene and take action. And that's a critical process. I think with psychological health, we talk about this a great deal, but the impact of psychological health on your cognitive function, your concentration, memory, decision-making, your physical health. I mean, there's a raft of data now showing its impact on your physical health and longevity. but also your behavior, how you relate to your fellow man and woman. So I think psychological health now is, once you've recruited bright, competent, capable, intelligent people, which organizations go to a huge lengths to do, once you've recruited them, the best predictor of their performance is their psychological well-being. So once you've measured it, you then need to understand what are the risk factors that actually deplete psychological well-being, and what are the protective factors. So what nourishes and what depletes the human spirit. And once you've got that data, you can start to actually influence outcomes, which I think is a very exciting process. So I think measurement really matters. Absolutely.
And I think we've seen such a shift in workplace approaches to psychological health, even in the last 12 months. I mean, it's moved on just so much in terms of mindset, but also understanding around it. And organizations collect vast amounts of data around individuals, around culture, around leadership. I think this is going to be such an exciting development within the management of psychological health, and particularly the proactive management of psychological health in businesses. I mean, Elle, I'd love to come to you, because you've obviously led our insights team. You're working with clients across the globe, collecting data and insights about the individual factors, which we've touched on, and people are probably more au fait with, but also and I think the bit we really want to look into is the cultural and the leadership factors, and the relationship between those two. Can you just give us some of your high level thoughts around those two things?
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to share some slides. You guys see those?
I can see those.
Great. Okay, so I think partly in response to the pandemic, but just in response to a general, I guess, appetite to understand psychological health in organizations. So measuring psychological health is actually quite complex. It can be really complex, but actually, if you really focus in on the most common psychological health problems, they account for the vast majority of the variance and a lot of what will be affecting individuals within organizations. So what we've tried to do is to really simplify this, because we've now got a psychological health index, which is an index score on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10 represents higher psychological health. And this takes into account things like anxiety and worry, low mood, distractibility, things like stress, and a number of questions. And ultimately what this does is it provides you with an overview of the psychological health of individuals across an organization, and you can also look at subgroups. So what you might see is a slightly lower score for psych health for, say, younger individuals, say under 35 years. So they're a slightly higher risk group from a psychological health perspective. So you can compare different groups, but you have this overall sense of where your organization is. And the reason that's helpful is if you're doing that persistently during the pandemic, where people are less visible and working from home, you can start to get an overall sense of where psychological health is moving. And obviously this will be moving related to factors inside and outside of the workplace. So I think once you have this score, it's really helpful, especially if you're a research psychologist, because essentially you have an outcome. So if psychological health is the outcome, the thing you're looking to improve and shift, if you measure that, you can then start to look at the environmental and cultural factors that impact upon psychological health. So linked to that, so once you understand the levels of support individuals need, the next thing you can look to do is start reflecting on the culture and the environment. The reason this is really important is related to the fact that we know that things like social support, social cohesion, and different environmental factors and social factors are really influential over psychological health. So if you're looking to sustain good psychological health, once you provide individuals with the skills and resources to manage their psychological health, the best thing you can do then is try and create a cultural workplace environment that really helps to sustain that over time. So then how do you break that down? So basically, you're trying to create a culture which is supportive, it's psychologically aware and informed, and it has lots of protective factors for psychological health embedded within it. And what we've looked to do is we've searched a lot of literature. There's lots of brilliant literature around this. And we've looked to understand, we've done a lot of analysis based on various data sets. And we've essentially run factor analyses, which enable you to distinguish between different components. So we're looking at things across, because we're looking at culture, we're having to look at things across individual, team, line manager, leadership and organizational levels. But to distinguish between meaningful components that then collectively mean something from a cultural perspective has essentially been the goal. So what this means is we then score organizations based on these individual level factors, on the team factors, line manager, leadership and organizational awareness, in terms of how sort of conducive, how helpful that culture currently is at supporting psychological health. And then we come up with this, these are all weighted, and then we come up with this overall index score. So then you have a really good sense of how you're scoring on all these different things, and also what your overall score is. So you have a sense of, yeah, your sort of low, medium and high scoring areas. And then the measure of a good index. So how do we know our culture index means anything after you do all that research and statistics and whatever? So you get to a point where you need to see if your index score actually predicts the outcome of interest. So does our culture index score predict good psychological health within organizations? And that's known as predictive validity. So ultimately, if that's the point of the culture index score, you want to see a nice consistent relationship between the two, like a nice linear relationship. And what we do find is that when you see this culture index score shifting upwards, you do see the psychological health of individuals within those organizations reporting higher psychological health. And that's sort of demonstrated by the graph. It gives you a feel. And the reason you care about that is that's reassuring that if you do shift some of these cultural components and your overall score, that you will start to create an environment that will be beneficial to individuals' psychological health. So basically that just kind of means that it works, which is always reassuring.
I mean, just on that, I mean, I think it's absolutely, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? Like there's so much of the conversation around mental health, psychological health has had an individual focus, and how do we support the individuals? But we've always known that the environment has such an influence on that, and particularly social support, those around us. So it makes complete and utter sense that this impacts. But I think just that relationship is so interesting, and I think it's really creates a great sort of opportunity and agency for leaders, for organizations to change these things, because these actually also sit within their power to change. And I think that's a real shift in terms of mindset around how to influence psychological health. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all good. And it's a good point, because I think a lot of the frustration comes from, I think when you provide resources or you provide individual level support, and seeing mixed results. So I think just having this approach where you also reflect on the environment is really important. So and then what you can look to do is, so do all of our individual components all relate to psychological health? And we know they do, but are some more strongly associated than others? And what you can do is, once you have data, and this is just an example, is you can start to understand what the biggest levers for change are. So which component, so which factor that if you shift it creates the biggest shift in psychological health. And some of these are much more practical to influence than others. So if you see on one of these is sort of autonomy and flexibility, and you might be able to influence policy or work with individuals. But equally, some of them, it sort of involves less people and it's kind of more practical to influence. So
and they're governed by different factors, your business model, the sector you're in. So some of these are quite rigid within certain groups or industries, aren't they?
Yeah.
And some of them are actually, so some of them will be lower hanging fruit for some organizations, or actually really quite complex for others. But I think it gives you a map, doesn't it, to consider, where you can have an influence, and which ones are the, I suppose, are the easiest to influence with the resources you have.
Yeah, and I think it's nice to pick your battles off the back of having data. Like for me, that's the crucial piece. I think when you have conversations that are all kind of abstract around what, opinions around the things that will be most effective, I think, personally, I just find it reassuring to have those opinions and thoughts backed up by some data where possible. So, and then lastly, what you can do, if you're still with me, is once you have your different cultural scores and you understand the biggest levers for change, you can also start to understand, because you're looking at essentially an ecosystem, so everything will be interrelated, you can start to see the relationships between things in your organization. So, for example, I pulled out senior leadership behaviors, and you can see how these are highly correlated with leadership behaviors. They're also moderately correlated with line managers, relationships with their staff, with team cohesion, and with these individual level factors such as belonging, purpose and meaning, and even to some extent workplace stress. So I think it's really helpful. It provides a bit of a roadmap. And I think all of this information can just start to really guide sort of a really strategic approach to psychological health. And then by remeasuring, you can check if it's working. And if the numbers aren't shifting, you can reflect on your approach. So, yeah.
And I think just understanding that the relationship between these factors is so helpful, doesn't it? I mean, these really are, which lever do we want to pull? Which one can we pull? And and what do we, what's the predictive impact of doing that? So I think this is, as you say, Elle, this is about creating a tangible, sustainable approach to proactively influencing not just psychological health, but all of these performance factors. So you start to see the data improve around this, not just in psychological health data, but in all other data you're collecting, performance metrics, engagement, absenteeism, whatever it is. So thank you very much for sharing that, Elle. I think it's fascinating. And I know I've mentioned this already, but I think it's this, we've been talking to organizations in this space for 10 years around this, and there really has been this huge shift in spotlight from to the social, to the cultural, to the organization. And I think it's really exciting to see that there's a tangible, data-driven way to actually drive psychological health, through those that you spend so much time with and work with. And it makes sense, doesn't it, from a social support factor and all of the research that we look at around those individual factors. So it's not about not looking at the individual. There's things we can do around the individual, but we know that's such a complex space. This actually is something that's within the gift of organizations, within the gift of leaders, that they can actually tangibly change. Any thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic. I mean, for me, this is a game changer, because I think what it does and what Elle's work does and lots of other research has done is highlight how this can be organizationally specific. So a bit like we as humans may have different physical health problems or different risk factors and protective factors. What we need to do is tease these out, and this is organizationally specific. So I think being able to do this in different organizations and understand what the hotspots are, and then that informs what you can do. And I think that targeted approach is really exciting, and it links to a sort of audit cycle, really. You put in an intervention, you see if it shifted the process, you remeasure, and you realize that you're making a difference. And I think that's a really exciting intervention. The other thing I'd just touch on here is leadership. And Elle's data just highlighting the importance of that. I mean, what we've been bowled over by is our research looking at leadership and its impact on what happens in the organization. And I think this is something that's talked about a lot, but what Elle's data demonstrates is the legacy, the tone from the top, the shadow of the leader, how people behave in leadership has huge impact. And it really does cascade through the organization. And I think it links to one of the biggest behavioral factors that you can look at that influences human behavioral change, which is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is really about whether behaviors are valued and rewarded. And if you value and reward the behavior, you will reinforce the behavior. And I think historically, what a lot of our professional services have done is reward technical knowledge or financial. They haven't rewarded perhaps the leadership skills in the same way. And I think we just done a big piece of work with a large audit firm. And what came out from that is that everybody in this organization at a very senior level really valued this concept of support, social connection. But they didn't measure it, so they couldn't reward it. And I think this is, again, comes back to this concept of what you measure gets managed. And then I suppose that the final thing I touch on is this whole issue of being a social animal. And I think what Elle's research demonstrates is that the link between social support and how we talk to each other and how we treat each other to our psychological health, and this concept of trust and reciprocity. And I just think organizations that value that, reward that, are going to get the inside track. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity to mitigate where we started today, which is to mitigate the psychological impact of COVID. We know from very powerful research in medicine that social support is a neurobiological driver of psychological safety. It reduces stress, it reduces pain. If organizations can create a supportive, collaborative, collegiate, affiliative environment, that will go an awfully long way to mitigate some of the impacts of COVID-19.
Absolutely. No, I can completely agree. So just in case anyone is tuned in today wants to know more about our insights approach, both Elle and I have put time aside to arrange time to meet with anyone and share more around the approach, the data, the research. So do get in touch. I think Elle's going to put a link in the chat or the Q&A at the moment. So that will go out. Yeah, do get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you and share more around what we're doing in this space. Just to Brian, Elle, thank you again for your time today. Just to sum up, I think what we're hearing is that we started out discussing that there's going to be a real challenge around an ongoing challenge around psychological health. It is going to increase even as and hopefully as we come out of the lockdown of the pandemic. There's going to be this increase in psychological health challenges, particularly in younger people, and I think that that links into the leadership message that Brian has touched on. And I think there's this really exciting opportunity around measurement, but measuring what matters, and measuring, so not just measuring and looking at the individual, looking at the culture, because that's where this great opportunity lies. And I think if you look at psychological health, we've seen quite a few trends around this. In 2 or 3 years' time, I think there won't be an organization that isn't measuring this. So I think there's so much development to happen here, so much progress. It's extremely exciting. And I'm just going to leave you with a quote from Seth Godin that I think is rather good. He says, "Measurement is fabulous unless you're busy measuring what's easy to measure as opposed to what's important." I'll leave you with that message. I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for joining. It's always a pleasure. We hope you enjoy it, and do join us for the next one, which I think will be in a few weeks' time, where we're going to be looking at difficult conversations around psychological health. So more to come on that. Thank you so much. Thanks, Elle. Thanks, Brian. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.